The pen was still on the desk. The ink on the executive order had not dried. The cameras were still running. The White House press pool had not yet filed their first dispatch. And in Ottawa, Mark Carney was already standing at a podium. Not because he had been tipped off, not because of a leak inside the administration, but because the order Trump had just signed contained a structural flaw so fundamental, so irreversible, that Canada had identified it 14 months ago and had been waiting quietly for the moment it became public. What happened in the next 11 minutes will be studied in economics departments and diplomatic war rooms for a generation, not because of what Trump signed, but because of 9 words spoken in a flat, unhurried voice by a former central banker who had spent his entire career walking into rooms where everything was on fire. 9 words, $200 billion, and a strategy that collapsed before the press conference ended. Before we go further, what you are about to hear goes deeper than anything the major networks covered. This channel breaks down the architecture of these decisions, not who won and who lost, but why, and what it means for what comes next. If that is the kind of analysis you want, follow this channel and turn on notifications. We publish every 24 hours. Now, back to the desk, and the pen, and the ink that had not yet dried. The executive order Trump signed that morning was titled the American Economic Sovereignty Protection Act. It ran to 47 pages. It had been drafted over 6 weeks by a team inside the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. It imposed a 35% tariff on all Canadian manufactured goods entering the United States, effective in 30 days. It included a secondary provision freezing all joint infrastructure investment agreements between the two countries pending a renegotiation of terms. And it contained a third provision, buried on page 31 in a subsection titled Reciprocal Dependency Realignment, that directed American federal agencies to begin auditing all supply chain dependencies on Canadian inputs across 12 critical sectors. The order was designed to do 3 things simultaneously. First, it was designed to pressure Canadian manufacturers into relocating production to the United States by making Canadian exports economically unviable. Second, it was designed to signal to Trump's domestic base that American economic sovereignty was being actively defended. Third, and most importantly, it was designed to force Mark Carney to the negotiating table from a position of weakness, to make Canada choose between accepting new terms or watching its largest export market become inaccessible overnight. On paper, the logic was not irrational. Canada sends approximately 76% of its exports to the United States. A 35% tariff on manufactured goods would hit Canadian factories, Canadian workers, and Canadian GDP in ways that would be visible and painful within weeks. The calculation inside the White House was straightforward. Canada cannot absorb this. Carney will call within 72 hours. What the White House did not know, what the team that drafted the order had failed to account for, was that page 31 had already been read. Not by Canadian intelligence, not by a leak, but because the structural logic of the order was, to anyone with deep knowledge of North American supply chains, entirely predictable. And Canada had not been idle. 14 months before Trump signed the order, the Canadian Department of Finance had commissioned a classified economic stress test. The stress test was not titled anything dramatic. It was called the North American Trade Dependency Resilience Assessment. It was 340 pages long. It was produced by a team of 23 economists, 8 supply chain specialists, and 4 former central bank officials, one of whom had worked directly under Carney at the Bank of England. The question the stress test was designed to answer was simple. If the United States imposed maximum tariff pressure on Canada across all manufactured goods simultaneously, what would the actual damage be? And more importantly, what would the damage be on the American side that American policymakers were not modeling? The answer was not what the White House assumed. Yes, Canadian manufacturers would be hurt. The stress test estimated a 4.2% contraction in Canadian manufacturing output in the first year, with concentrated pain in automotive, aerospace, and consumer goods sectors. That was real. That was painful. Carney's team did not minimize it, But the stress test also found something that American trade analysts had systematically undercounted. The 35% tariff on Canadian manufactured goods would trigger, under existing CUSMA provisions, an automatic reciprocal review mechanism, a clause that had been inserted into the agreement during the 2018 renegotiation at Canada's insistence, and that American negotiators had agreed to without fully modeling its downstream consequences. That clause, Article 3210, subsection B, gave Canada the legal right, not the option, the right, to immediately suspend preferential access agreements in sectors where retaliatory tariffs had been imposed. And Canada had spent 14 months identifying exactly which suspensions would create maximum structural pressure on the American economy while remaining fully defensible under international trade law. The list was specific: pharmaceutical precursor chemicals, aerospace-grade aluminum, softwood lumber for residential construction, hydroelectric power to 6 American border states, and most consequentially, the specialized automotive components, 847 distinct parts, that American car manufacturers sourced exclusively from Canadian suppliers and for which no alternative domestic source existed. The stress test conclusion was precise. If Trump imposed a 35% tariff on Canadian manufactured goods, Canada could respond with targeted suspensions that would add an estimated $340 to $600 to the cost of every vehicle manufactured in the United States, halt residential construction in 3 major American cities within 90 days, and trigger pharmaceutical supply disruptions affecting an estimated 14 million Americans who depended on medications with Canadian-sourced active ingredients. The White House had modeled Canadian pain. They had not modeled their own. Mark Carney walked to the podium at 11:47 a.m. He was not wearing a flag pin. He had no notes visible on the podium surface. He did not bring advisors to stand behind him. He looked directly into the camera in the flat, unhurried way of someone who has delivered bad news in boardrooms for 30 years and has learned that calm is not the absence of urgency. It is the most precise way to communicate that you already know how this ends. He said, "We read the order. We have been ready for this for 14 months. 9 words. Not a threat, not a condemnation, not a political speech. A statement of operational fact delivered with the emotional register of a man reading a weather report." The room reacted before he continued, because those 9 words did something that no amount of rhetorical escalation could have done. They told every journalist, every diplomat, every market analyst watching the live feed exactly what had happened. Trump had swung, and Canada had not just blocked the punch. Canada had known the punch was coming, had studied its trajectory, had positioned accordingly, and was now calmly explaining to the world that the fight was already over. Carney then spent the next 10 minutes and 43 seconds doing something no political leader in a trade confrontation had done before. He read the order back, provision by provision, and next to each provision, he stated Canada's prepared response, not as a threat, but as an already executed fact. Provision 1, the 35% tariff on manufactured goods. Canada's response, immediate invocation of Article 3210, subsection B, suspending preferential access in 5 sectors, effective the same day. Provision 2, the freeze on joint infrastructure agreements. Canada's response, redirection of $47 billion in planned joint infrastructure investment toward agreements already signed with the European Union, Japan, and the United Kingdom under the Democratic Commerce Alliance framework, agreements that had been finalized, Carney paused here, 11 days ago. Provision 3, the supply chain dependency audit. Canada's response, publication of Canada's own audit, conducted 14 months prior, documenting American dependency on Canadian inputs across 12 sectors. A document Carney announced would be released publicly within the hour because, he said, if the United States intends to audit its dependencies on Canada, it is only efficient that we provide them with the data they will find. The precision was surgical. Not one word was theatrical. Not one number was approximate. Every response had a legal basis, a timeline, and a dollar figure. The White House had brought a tariff to a supply chain fight. The markets moved before Carney finished speaking. Within 23 minutes of the press conference beginning, automotive sector stocks fell an average of 6.8% as analysts processed the implication of 847 automotive components with no domestic American alternative. Residential construction futures dropped 4.1% on the softwood lumber suspension. A pharmaceutical index tracking companies with Canadian-sourced active ingredients fell 3.2%. By the end of the trading day, the combined market movement represented an estimated $340 billion in reduced equity value across affected sectors. The executive order had been signed to protect $200 billion in American economic interests. The response had erased $340 billion in market value before the New York Stock Exchange closed. Inside the White House, the reaction was not what the communications team had prepared for. The order was supposed to generate headlines about American strength, American sovereignty, American manufacturing revival. Instead, every major financial publication led with a version of the same story. Canada had been ready. America had not known. 3 Republican senators from automotive-dependent states issued statements within 4 hours demanding emergency consultations with the administration. The National Association of Home Builders released a projection estimating that the softwood lumber suspension would add between $18,000 and $24,000 to the cost of an average new American home. The American Pharmaceutical Association warned of potential supply disruptions in 23 drug categories. The governor of Michigan, a state where 1 in 8 jobs is tied directly or indirectly to automotive manufacturing, held a press conference and said something that no governor had said publicly during any previous phase of the trade confrontation. She said, "We were not consulted. The industries that will absorb this were not consulted. And the people who will lose their jobs were not consulted. I need to know who modeled this, because whoever modeled this did not talk to anyone in this state." The question was not answered publicly. It has not been answered since. What the Brussels performance demonstrated in press conference form and what the steel order demonstrated in market form, this moment demonstrated in structural form. Canada had not won because of superior resources. Canada had not won because of a larger economy or a more powerful military or a more influential diplomatic network. Canada had won because one side had done the work and the other side had assumed the work was not necessary. The 340-page stress test was not produced because Canada was aggressive. It was produced because Canada understood something fundamental about asymmetric trade confrontations. The side that models the other side's vulnerabilities more accurately than the other side models their own will always have more options at the moment of decision. Trump's team had modeled Canadian pain. They had modeled it correctly. The 4.2% manufacturing contraction was real. The pressure on Canadian workers was real. The political difficulty for Carney was real, but they had not modeled American pain. They had not read Article 3210. They had not mapped the 847 automotive components. They had not tracked the softwood lumber dependency. They had not counted the 14 million Americans on medications with Canadian-sourced active ingredients. They had looked at the relationship and seen only what Canada needed from America. They had not asked what America needed from Canada. That omission, that single, sustained, 14-month-long omission, was the $340 billion mistake. Carney did not gloat. He did not need to. The numbers gloated for him. The pen was still on the desk. Somewhere in the White House, in a room where a 47-page order had been drafted over 6 weeks by people who believed they had modeled every variable, that pen was still lying next to the signature that had triggered a response Canada had been building for 14 months. The ink had dried. The order was law, and across every sector it was designed to protect automotive, construction, pharmaceutical, energy. The damage was already being calculated in real time by people who had not been consulted, in states that had not been warned, by industries that had not been asked. 9 words, spoken without drama, without a flag pin, without notes. We read the order. We have been ready for this for 14 months. Not a threat, a receipt. The question that remains, the question that will define the next phase of this confrontation, is not whether Canada was prepared. Canada was prepared. The question is whether the administration that signed that order is capable of asking the one question they failed to ask before the ink dried. What does the other side already know that we do not? The answer in this case was everything, and it cost $340 billion to find out.